Little girl ran into the club crying, "Please help my mama." The Hell's Angel went dead silent. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a cold, quiet night at the Hell's Angels clubhouse, the heavy rumble of motorcycles parked outside. Inside, the usual noise of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, with a haze of cigarette smoke hanging thick in the room. It was just another evening when, without warning, the door swung open. A young girl, no older than 8, burst through, her face streaked with tears, her small body trembling. Her hands gripped the doorframe for support as she cried out, "Please help my mama." The room fell dead silent. The clatter of glasses stopped instantly, and all eyes turned to her. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The tough, hardened bikers who had seen it all were now staring at a little girl in distress. There was no sound except for the girl's sobs, and even the bravest of men in the room hesitated, unsure of what to do. The girl's voice broke through the silence again, desperation in every word. "She's hurt. Please, I don't know who else to turn to." A heavy-set man, tattooed and wearing the familiar Hell's Angels patch on his leather jacket, stood up. His nickname, Razor, was known across the state, and his reputation as a cold, fearless enforcer was legendary. But as he locked eyes with the girl, something inside him shifted. "Where is she?" Razor asked, his voice deep and rough, but there was an undeniable softness behind it. The girl didn't hesitate. "A few blocks away," she said between sobs. She's bleeding." Without another word, Razor grabbed his jacket, tossing it on quickly. The other bikers exchanged uneasy looks. This wasn't the kind of thing they usually dealt with. Most would have stayed put, leaving it to someone else, but not Razor. With a firm motion, he signaled to his brothers, who immediately followed. The air outside was colder, the wind biting as they rode through the streets. The hum of Razor's bike seemed to match the pounding in his chest. He had seen violence, had caused violence, but this was different. The sound of the engine drowned out all other thoughts in his head. The bike skidded to a stop in front of a small, rundown house. The girl, still clutching his jacket sleeve, pointed to the front door. Razor walked in, and what he saw shook him to his core. The woman lay on the floor, her body battered and bruised, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. The room was a mess, a sign of a struggle, and the smell of fear lingered in the air. Razor knelt beside her, his hardened exterior now cracked, replaced with a quiet concern. He gently checked her pulse. It was weak, but she was still alive. "We need help," Razor said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The little girl, standing by the door, watched him. Her eyes were filled with hope, but also fear. Razor turned back to her. "Don't worry," he said softly. "Your mom's going to be okay." As he carefully lifted the woman into his arms, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this choice, was going to change everything for him. The biker who had once been known for taking lives was now saving one. Razor's brothers, standing outside, watched the scene unfold in silence. They knew this wasn't just another night. Something deep had shifted, and none of them could predict where this path would lead. The moment Razor picked the woman up, his hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He knew he had to act fast, but there was something inside him that was telling him to slow down. He glanced at the little girl, who was watching them closely. Her wide eyes reflected not just fear, but also hope, a hope that Razor could not ignore. He gently adjusted his grip on the woman, cradling her against his chest as he stood up. The room felt smaller now, quieter, and the faint sound of the woman's shallow breathing was the only thing that filled the space. He knew he couldn't waste any more time. The others were outside, waiting, and they were all counting on him to do the right thing. Razor carefully stepped over the debris in the room, making his way toward the door. As soon as he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap. He felt it rush through his jacket, cutting through the heat from the house. His mind was on the woman in his arms, but his instincts kept scanning the street for any sign of danger. He couldn't help it. After all the years in the club, after all the violence he'd seen, his senses were always on alert. The little girl followed closely behind him, her footsteps light but steady. She had stopped crying now, but her face was still pale. She held onto the sleeve of Razor's jacket, her small hand gripping it, as if she were afraid to let go. Is she going to be okay? The girl's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. Razor didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure himself. He didn't know if this woman would make it, but he wasn't going to let her die alone. We'll get her help, he said, his voice low but calm. I promise. He could feel the weight of the promise hanging in the air. The others were already starting their bikes, their engines roaring to life. Razor knew he had to move fast. He walked toward his bike, carefully placing the woman on the back of it. The girl climbed on behind him, holding tightly to his waist as Razor revved the engine. The sound of the motorcycles filled the streets, the low rumble of the bikes echoing through the empty neighborhood. Razor focused on the road ahead, but in his peripheral vision, he saw the girl's face, her wide eyes filled with gratitude and worry. He felt a pang in his chest, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for weakness. He had a job to do. They rode in silence, the wind rushing past them as the city lights blurred in the distance. Razor's mind raced. He kept thinking about the woman, her blood, her injuries, the way she had looked at him when he first found her. She was just a stranger, yet in that moment, she had become something more. She had become someone he had to protect. They finally arrived at the hospital, and Razor carefully helped the woman off the bike. The girl jumped off quickly, running to the doors of the emergency room, banging on them with her tiny fists. A nurse rushed out, her eyes wide when she saw the condition the woman was in. What happened? The nurse asked, quickly ushering them inside. Razor didn't say anything. He stepped back, letting the medical professionals take over. The girl was standing by, her face full of worry. Razor knelt down in front of her, his gaze softening as he looked into her eyes. She's in good hands now, he said gently. The girl nodded, but Razor could see the fear still lingering in her expression. Will she be okay? She asked again, her voice barely audible. Razor hesitated for a moment before answering. I don't know, he said truthfully, but I'll make sure you're okay. He placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. As they waited in the sterile, quiet hospital room, Razor found himself staring at the floor. The weight of the night's events was starting to settle on him. He had done what he could, but now, he had to wait, just like the little girl. He glanced up, catching a glimpse of her as she sat in the waiting room chair, her legs swinging nervously. She was trying to be brave, but Razor could see she was scared. In that moment, Razor realized something. For the first time in a long while, he cared about someone other than himself. He had made promises before, but this promise, was different. He would make sure this little girl and her mother would never have to feel alone again. The minutes dragged by slowly, and Razor found himself staring at the clock on the wall. He kept thinking about the woman and the girl. What had happened to them? Who had hurt them? And more importantly, who would come after them now? Razor's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a nurse approaching. She was holding a clipboard and looking at them with a sympathetic expression. She's stable, the nurse said, her voice calm. Razor felt the tension in his body ease slightly, but it didn't disappear completely. She's going to make it? He asked, trying to keep the hope from creeping into his voice. The nurse nodded. Yes, she'll be fine. It'll take some time, but she'll pull through. Razor let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to the little girl, who had been watching him closely. Your mama's going to be okay, he told her softly. The girl's face lit up with a small, tentative smile. Razor felt his heart soften. He had done his job, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. He had made a promise to protect them, and Razor always kept his promises. He was in this for the long haul now, no matter what it took. The hours at the hospital seemed to stretch on forever. Razor sat in the waiting room, his mind racing with thoughts of the woman and the little girl. The sterile white walls felt suffocating, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights above did little to calm the growing anxiety inside him. He kept replaying the events in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. Who would do such a thing to a woman and her child? Who would hurt them like that? The nurse had told him that the woman would recover, but Razor knew the scars left behind weren't just physical. The little girl, who had already endured so much, was a silent testament to that. She hadn't spoken much since the woman was taken into the ER, but Razor could see the worry in her eyes, the weight of the world pressing down on her small shoulders. Every now and then, the girl would glance at Razor, her eyes filled with questions, but she never asked. She just sat there, her small fingers clutched tightly around the edge of the chair, her legs dangling, too short to touch the ground. Razor had made promises before, to himself and to the club, but this promise was different. He had never been this close to a situation like this. The Hells Angels didn't get involved in family matters. They didn't rescue people. They didn't get emotional. But something about this little girl, this mother, had broken through the walls Razor had spent years building around his heart. His brothers in the club would never understand. They would never get why he felt the need to protect them. They'd probably think he was soft, or worse, that he was taking on something that wasn't his fight. But Razor didn't care. He had seen enough pain in his life to last several lifetimes. He'd dealt with enough violence, enough broken relationships, enough loss to know that sometimes, just sometimes, you had to do the right thing. And this was the right thing. Razor glanced up as the nurse came through the door. She had a clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. She smiled gently when she saw him. "She's awake," she said, her voice calm but soft. Razor's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, his hands brushing off his leather jacket as he approached the nurse. "Is she all right?" he asked, his voice rougher than he meant. The nurse nodded. "She's stable now. She still needs rest, but she's awake and responsive. You can see her if you'd like." Razor didn't need to be told twice. He followed the nurse down the hallway, his boots echoing on the polished floor. He could feel the weight of his own footsteps, the gravity of the situation settling in. As they reached the room, the nurse knocked softly before opening the door. Razor stepped inside, his eyes immediately falling on the woman lying in the bed. She was pale, her face bruised and swollen, but her eyes, those eyes, were clear. She looked up at him, a weak smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You," she started, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You saved us." Razor didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being thanked, and certainly not by someone like her. He had never been a hero, never wanted to be. He had always been the enforcer, the guy who took care of business, who made sure things got done. But this was different. "You don't have to thank me," Razor said, his voice low and steady. "I just did what needed to be done." The woman nodded weakly, her eyes closing for a moment before she opened them again. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come," she said, her voice shaky. Razor felt something tighten in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Compassion. He didn't want to feel it. He didn't want to care. But for some reason, he couldn't help it. The little girl was standing in the doorway now, looking up at Razor with wide, hopeful eyes. Razor looked at her, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he felt the full weight of the promise he had made. He had promised to protect them, and he would keep that promise. The girl slowly walked toward the bed, her eyes never leaving Razor's. "Is Mama going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small but full of concern. Razor crouched down in front of her, looking into her eyes. "She's going to be fine," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You don't have to worry about her anymore." The little girl smiled, and for the first time that night, Razor felt like he had done something good, something that mattered. As the nurse left the room, Razor took a seat in the corner, his eyes fixed on the woman and the little girl. He could feel the weight of the promise still hanging over him. He had to make sure they were safe. He had to make sure no one ever hurt them again. Razor knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be people who would try to hurt them, people who would try to take them from him. But he was ready. He had made a promise, and Razor always kept his promises. The next few days passed in a blur. Razor spent every waking moment watching over the woman and the little girl, making sure they were safe and well taken care of. The hospital had discharged the woman, but her recovery would take time. The bruises on her face, the cuts on her arms, and the swelling in her leg told a story of violence, a story that Razor couldn't shake from his mind. He had seen people hurt before. He had hurt people himself, but this was different. These were innocent people, people who didn't deserve any of this. Razor couldn't stop thinking about the man who had hurt them, the one responsible for what had happened. The woman, whose name he had learned was Sarah, had been reluctant to talk about her past, but the little girl, whose name was Emma, had no such reservations. She told him everything she knew, in bits and pieces. Her father was never around, and her mother had been trying to make a life for them on her own. They had been living in a small, run-down house on the edge of town when things had gone wrong. Emma spoke of a man who had come into their lives not long ago, a man who had promised Sarah that he would take care of them, a man who had offered them protection. But, as Emma said, he wasn't good. He hurt Mama. Razor clenched his jaw at the thought of it. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing. He was going to find out. Razor wasn't sure what exactly had happened between Sarah and this man, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. His brothers in the club had been silent about everything, and that bothered him. The Hells Angels didn't usually interfere in personal matters like this. But Razor wasn't like the others. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not after making that promise to Emma. The club had their own rules, their own code, and Razor had always followed it. But right now, all he could think about was protecting Sarah and Emma. As the days passed, Razor took it upon himself to make sure the two of them had everything they needed. He moved them into a small, safe house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Razor made sure the house was secured, with enough locks on the doors and windows to keep anyone from getting inside. He kept an eye on the streets around their home, watching for any signs of trouble. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to find out where they were. Sarah, although grateful for his help, was still a shell of the woman she had once been. She spent most of her days resting, her mind still haunted by the events that had led them here. Emma, on the other hand, had started to warm up to Razor, her trust growing in small steps. She would often follow him around the house, asking him questions about his life, about the club, about everything and nothing. Razor wasn't used to being around kids, and he found himself struggling to find the right words. But when Emma smiled at him, when she looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes, he couldn't help but feel something stir in his chest. For the first time in a long time, Razor felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. It wasn't just about the club, the ride, or the fights. It was about protecting these two people who needed him. Razor was determined to find the man who had hurt them, and he was willing to do whatever it took. He started asking around, talking to people in town who might know something. He had his connections, but the word on the street was that the man they were looking for was dangerous. He had connections of his own, people who would protect him. Razor knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew he couldn't let it go. One night, as Razor was walking through the small, dimly lit town, he saw a familiar face standing by the bar. It was one of his brothers from the club, a man named Hawk. Hawk had always been the quiet one, the one who never spoke much, but when he did, people listened. Razor walked up to him. "Hawk, you know anything about a guy named Frank?" "Frank Burns." Hawk didn't answer right away, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. "Why do you want to know about him?" Razor's tone was firm but low. "He's the one who hurt Sarah and Emma," he said. Hawk's expression shifted. He knew exactly who Razor was talking about. "Frank's bad news," Hawk said quietly. "He's been around for a while. Ties to some people who aren't exactly friendly with the club. You're not going to get him easy." Razor's fists clenched. He had expected as much. "I don't care how hard it is," he said, his voice cold. "I'm going after him. You're with me, or you're not." Hawk studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'm with you," he said simply. Razor turned and walked away, his mind already working on a plan. He knew the stakes were high, and he knew the risk was great. But he also knew one thing for sure. He was going to make sure that Frank Burns paid for what he had done. Razor would do whatever it took to protect Sarah and Emma. His brothers in the club would understand, or they wouldn't. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The next few days were filled with tension. Razor kept his eyes open, knowing that finding Frank Burns would not be easy. He had gathered his small team, including Hawk, and set the plan in motion. The club wasn't directly involved, but Razor had made it clear that he wasn't going to let this go. His promise to Sarah and Emma was still fresh in his mind, and no matter what it took, he was going to make sure they were safe. Razor's mind never stopped working, constantly thinking about what might happen next. Every time he walked past the little house where Sarah and Emma were staying, his eyes would scan the street. He was always looking over his shoulder, making sure no one followed him. He knew Frank had people watching, people who would come after him if they knew what he was planning. Razor had to be careful. Hawk had reached out to some of his contacts, people who might know where Frank was hiding. The word on the street was that Frank had been laying low for a while, keeping his distance. That only made Razor more certain that he was getting close. One evening, Razor was walking through a neighborhood he had visited before, the night air cool against his skin, when he spotted a familiar face in the distance. It was one of Frank's men. The man looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder, as if he was making sure no one was watching him. Razor knew this was his chance. He approached slowly, keeping his distance. He didn't want to start a scene, not yet. The man was heading into a small alleyway, and Razor decided to follow. He moved quietly, his boots making almost no sound on the pavement. As he reached the alley, Razor saw the man stop in front of a rundown building. It was old, with faded paint and boarded-up windows. Frank's hideout. Razor's heart raced, but he kept his cool. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He needed to confront Frank, but he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Razor stepped forward, keeping low, until he was right behind the man. He grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. The man's eyes went wide with surprise. "Where is he?" Razor demanded, his voice low and threatening. The man opened his mouth, but Razor cut him off. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not asking you again. Where is Frank?" The man swallowed hard, clearly scared. He had to know who Razor was and what he was capable of. "He's in there," the man finally said, his voice shaking. "He's been laying low for a few days. He's expecting someone." Razor didn't wait another second. He pushed the man aside and walked straight to the door of the building. He could feel the adrenaline surging through him, but he kept himself steady. This wasn't just about confronting Frank. It was about protecting Sarah and Emma, about making sure nothing like this would ever happen again. Razor kicked the door open, the sound of wood splintering filling the air. Inside, the place was dark, with only a few flickering lights illuminating the room. There was a faint smell of smoke and alcohol in the air, a sign that Frank had been spending his time here for a while. Razor's eyes scanned the room, looking for Frank. And then he saw him. Frank was sitting at a table in the back, his feet kicked up, looking completely at ease. He didn't seem surprised to see Razor, as if he had been expecting him. Well, Frank said with a smirk. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Razor didn't waste time with words. He lunged at Frank, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "You hurt a woman and a child. You think you're just going to walk away from that?" Razor's voice was a growl, his anger barely contained. Frank laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "You think you can stop me? You're just a biker, Razor. You don't scare me." Razor's fist collided with Frank's face, the force of the punch making Frank stumble back. "You should have stayed away from them," Razor said, his voice colder than ever. "Now, you're going to pay." Frank wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is over? You don't know who you're messing with." Razor didn't care. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to make sure Frank paid for what he had done. As Razor stepped forward, Frank reached for a knife that had been lying on the table. He lunged at Razor, but Razor was faster. He grabbed Frank's wrist and twisted it, forcing the knife out of his hand. Razor's knee connected with Frank's stomach, knocking the air out of him. Frank fell to the ground, gasping for breath. Razor stood over him, his breath heavy, his fists clenched. "You're done," Razor said, his voice steady. "You're never going near them again." Frank's eyes flickered with fear now, realizing that Razor wasn't going to stop until he was finished. "You don't know what you're up against," Frank muttered, his voice weak. "I'm not afraid of you." Razor leaned down, grabbing Frank by the shirt and pulling him up. "You should be," Razor said coldly, "because I'm not done with you yet." Razor left the building, leaving Frank behind, barely conscious. He knew it wasn't over yet, but for now, he had taken the first step in keeping his promise. Sarah and Emma were safe, for now. But Razor knew the fight wasn't over. He would protect them, no matter the cost. That was the promise he made, and he would keep it. Days passed, and Razor felt the weight of the promise he had made to Sarah and Emma more heavily than ever. After taking down Frank, he knew the danger was far from over. There were more people involved, more threats lurking in the shadows. But for the first time in a long while, Razor felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to the club or his past. It was tied to these two, Sarah and Emma, and keeping them safe. They had been through too much already, and he wasn't about to let anyone harm them again. Razor continued to keep a watchful eye on their small house on the outskirts of town. He spent his days making sure the perimeter was secure and checking in with Hawk about any leads. Frank's associates hadn't come after him yet, but Razor knew it was only a matter of time. He wasn't sure if Frank had any family or backup, but Razor had no intention of finding out the hard way. Hawk had put some feelers out, trying to gather intel about who might be backing Frank. The word on the street was that Frank wasn't a small player. He was connected to a bigger operation. Razor's gut told him that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. It wasn't just about protecting Sarah and Emma anymore. It was about standing up to a network of people who thought they could operate with impunity. Razor was determined to take them down, piece by piece. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on the job, he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and Emma. He had seen the toll this had taken on them. Sarah was still recovering from her injuries, both physical and emotional. She spent most of her time resting, but Razor could see that she was constantly on edge, as if waiting for the next blow to fall. Emma, on the other hand, had started to open up more. She was asking questions, trying to understand why everything had happened. Razor had never been good with kids, never had the right words to say, but something in Emma's innocent eyes kept him grounded. He couldn't protect them forever. At some point, he would have to let them go, but not yet. Not until it was safe. That evening, Razor found himself sitting outside on the porch of the small house. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the air was cooler, but not yet cold. The quiet of the evening was a rare piece he had come to appreciate. He had been pacing around the yard all day, checking for any signs of trouble, but so far, everything seemed calm. Emma was inside, sitting on the couch, flipping through a book. Sarah was resting in the bedroom, trying to get some sleep. Razor didn't want to disturb them. He knew they had been through enough. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her eyes tired but still holding that quiet strength Razor had come to admire. "You're out here a lot," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a sense of concern. Razor shrugged, not sure how to explain it. "Just keeping an eye on things." Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She took a seat beside him, her gaze following his out into the yard. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. "You're not going to let anything happen to us, are you?" Sarah's question was quiet, almost hesitant, but it hit Razor harder than he expected. He didn't look at her right away. He knew what she was asking, but it was a question he wasn't sure how to answer. "I'm doing everything I can to keep you safe," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I can't promise you that nothing will happen. All I can do is make sure you have a fighting chance." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes still focused on the horizon. "I don't know if I can keep going like this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared. Every day, I keep thinking they'll come back, that he'll come back for me, for Emma." Razor turned to look at her, his eyes hardening. "I won't let that happen," he said firmly. "I've got this under control. We'll handle it. No one's getting to you. Not while I'm breathing." Sarah met his gaze, and for a brief moment, the walls between them seemed to crumble. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it meant more than words. Razor felt something shift inside him. He had been shutting people out for so long, afraid to let anyone in. But in that moment, with Sarah's hand on his arm, he felt a sense of responsibility that went beyond his own survival. It was about more than just protecting them. It was about giving them a future. Razor stood up, brushing off the dirt from his jeans. He wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. Not for Sarah, not for Emma, and not for anyone who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. "Get some rest," he said softly, his voice filled with resolve. "Tomorrow, we make our next move." Sarah looked at him one last time before going back inside. Razor stayed outside a while longer, staring up at the stars. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself to feel any kind of hope, but tonight, as he watched the world around him grow quiet, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them. A chance for all of them to find peace, to move on from the past, and build something better. Razor didn't know how long it would take, but he would be there every step of the way. He would fight for them, no matter what. And if anyone tried to come for them again, they would have to go through him first. The days that followed were tense, but Razor was determined. He had made sure Sarah and Emma were safe in their new home, and now it was time to deal with the aftermath of Frank Burns' threats. Razor knew that Frank wasn't working alone. There were still people out there who would come after him if they thought he was vulnerable. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Frank had worn off, but Razor couldn't afford to relax. It was just the beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. He kept in touch with Hawk and other trusted members of the club, always staying one step ahead. They had gathered information on Frank's associates, and it wasn't long before they started to piece together a more complete picture. Frank had ties to several dangerous people, but Razor wasn't going to let that intimidate him. He had made a promise to Sarah and Emma, and he was going to keep it no matter what. The nights were long, and Razor spent them patrolling the area, making sure no one was following them. He couldn't be sure who Frank had informed, and Razor wasn't about to take any chances. Emma was starting to get used to the new house, her curiosity growing with each passing day. She was a smart little girl, and Razor often found himself caught in conversations with her. She would ask him about the club, about the bikes, about life. Razor didn't have all the answers, but he was doing his best to provide a sense of normalcy for her. He was still trying to figure out what kind of future they could have, but the more time he spent with Emma and Sarah, the more he realized that they had become his responsibility. The feeling of protectiveness had grown stronger with each day, and Razor found himself changing. His instincts to fight, to take down anyone who threatened them, were still there. But now, there was a new force inside him, a need to keep them safe, to give them a chance at a better life. He didn't know what that future looked like yet, but he was willing to fight for it. That afternoon, Razor received a call from Hawk. "We've got a lead on Frank's people," Hawk said. "They're moving closer. They're not wasting any time." Razor's stomach tightened. This wasn't unexpected, but hearing it out loud made it real. "Where are they?" Razor asked, his tone flat. Hawk's voice lowered. "They've been seen at a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's a known spot for people like Frank. We don't know who's with him, but it's worth checking out." Razor didn't hesitate. He knew what had to be done. He gathered his gear, checking his knives, his gun, making sure everything was in place. This was it. It was time to confront Frank's people once and for all. As Razor rode toward the warehouse, his mind raced. He had dealt with criminals like Frank before, but this was different. These were people who had hurt Sarah and Emma, and Razor wasn't about to let them get away with it. The warehouse loomed in the distance, an old industrial building that looked abandoned. Razor parked his bike a safe distance away, the engine quiet as he dismounted. He moved quickly, silently, his body trained to move through the shadows. The building was dark, but Razor's eyes adjusted quickly. He could see movement through the cracked windows, 2 men standing guard. Razor knew this wasn't going to be easy. He had to act fast, but not recklessly. He crouched behind a stack of crates, surveying the scene. The 2 guards were armed, and Razor could see a few more figures inside, their shadows flickering in the dim light. Razor wasn't going to take any chances. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let Frank slip away now. He pulled his gun from its holster and checked the chamber. Silent, quick, and precise. That was how Razor operated. He crept forward, his movements fluid as he closed the distance between him and the guards. The first guard never saw him coming. Razor moved like a shadow, disarming him with one swift motion. The man barely had time to react before Razor had him pinned to the ground. The second guard turned just in time to see Razor's fist connect with his jaw, sending him to the floor in an instant. Razor didn't stop to check if they were still breathing. He didn't have time. He moved toward the door, knowing that Frank was somewhere inside, and that this was the moment he had been preparing for. Razor burst through the door, gun raised. The men inside looked surprised, but only for a split second before they started to react. Razor's eyes quickly scanned the room, landing on Frank, who was sitting at a table with a few of his associates. Frank's expression was one of surprise, but there was no fear. Razor could see the arrogance in his eyes. "You're a little late," Frank sneered. Razor didn't waste words. He fired a shot into the ceiling, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "This ends now, Frank," Razor said coldly. "You're done." Frank stood up slowly, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You really think you can take me down?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Razor didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was done talking. The fight was coming to an end. Razor moved quickly, his gun aimed at Frank, but it wasn't about the gun. It was about making sure Frank would never hurt anyone again. Razor knew that this was it. It was over. Frank had made his last mistake, and Razor was going to make sure of it. The man who had once caused so much pain to Sarah and Emma would never hurt them again. Razor's fists clenched tighter, his focus sharp as he took the final step. This time, Frank wasn't going to get away. The air inside the warehouse was thick with tension. Frank, bloodied but defiant, stood in front of Razor, his eyes flashing with contempt. Razor's grip tightened on the gun, but his focus was razor-sharp. He had been here before. He had seen the fear in a man's eyes when they knew they were done. But Frank wasn't like that. He wasn't scared. Razor didn't know if it was arrogance or something else, but he was done talking. Frank had hurt too many people, Sarah, Emma, and countless others, and Razor wasn't going to let him get away with it. The quiet hum of the night outside was a stark contrast to the chaos inside, but Razor wasn't distracted. His mind was clear, focused entirely on the man standing before him. He knew what had to be done, but that didn't make it easier. "You've got nothing left, Frank," Razor said coldly. "You can't buy your way out of this. You can't run." Frank let out a laugh, his voice low and mocking. "You think this is over? You think I'm the only one? I've got people, big people. You think they'll let you walk away from this?" Razor took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Frank's. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not walking away. But you sure as hell are." Frank's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You really think you've won, huh? You're just a biker. What makes you think you've got it all figured out?" Razor's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "It's not about figuring it out," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It's about making sure you never hurt anyone again." Frank's expression shifted as he glanced around, his eyes searching for a way out, but Razor could see it in his face. He knew the end was near. "You're making a mistake," Frank spat. "This isn't over. You don't know who you're messing with." Razor didn't respond. Instead, he pulled the trigger, the deafening sound of the gunshot echoing through the warehouse. The bullet hit the floor just inches from Frank's foot, sending a clear message. Frank froze, his face going pale as he realized Razor wasn't going to let him go. "This is your last warning," Razor said, his voice unwavering. "You're not going anywhere." For the first time, Frank's bravado seemed to fade. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere left to go. Razor took another step forward, his expression hardening. "You've hurt too many people, Frank. And now, you're done." Frank opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to plead, but no words came out. He was realizing the gravity of the situation, that Razor wasn't going to let him slip away. But that didn't mean Razor was done. Razor had already made his decision. Frank's fate was sealed. With the gun still in his hand, Razor moved closer, locking eyes with Frank. He could feel the tension in the room, the heavy weight of the moment pressing down on him. For a split second, Razor hesitated. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but in the end, it didn't matter. Frank had hurt people he cared about, people he had sworn to protect, and that was enough. Razor made sure Frank knew exactly who was in charge, who was the one calling the shots now. He wasn't going to be intimidated by a man like Frank. Razor would never let someone like him continue to terrorize innocent people. With one final look at Frank, Razor turned and walked toward the door. As he stepped outside, he breathed deeply, trying to push the weight of the decision from his mind. But it wasn't easy. It never was. The road ahead wasn't going to be simple. There were still others out there, people connected to Frank, who would try to make their move. Razor couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. He knew he had to keep moving, keep fighting. But for now, he had done what he had set out to do. Frank was out of the picture, and that was one victory Razor could be proud of. As Razor made his way back to the small house where Sarah and Emma were staying, he felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders, just a little. He had kept his promise, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had done something right. When he arrived, he found Emma sitting on the porch, waiting for him. Her face lit up when she saw him, and for a moment, everything seemed okay again. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around him tightly. Razor stiffened for a moment, not used to the warmth of a child's embrace, but then he relaxed, allowing himself to feel the comfort of her hug. "You did it," Emma said, her voice full of innocence and hope. "You stopped the bad man." Razor smiled, his heart heavy but full. "Yeah, I did," he said quietly. "But there's still a lot to be done." He didn't want to burden her with the details, with the danger still out there, but Emma didn't need to know. Not yet. He had made sure she and her mother were safe, for now. That was all that mattered. Inside, Sarah was waiting, her face tired but relieved. When Razor walked in, She didn't say a word, but the look she gave him said everything. She had been waiting for this day, the day when the threat was finally over. Razor had done what he promised, and now, he could finally start thinking about the future. Razor didn't know what that future would look like. He didn't know where it would take him or what would happen next. But he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to face it. For Sarah. For Emma. For the first time in his life, Razor was ready to be something more than a biker. He was ready to be a protector. And that was just the beginning. Days passed, and Razor's life seemed to settle into an uneasy rhythm. Sarah was healing, both physically and mentally, though the scars of what she had endured would take much longer to fade. Emma, too, was adjusting to their new life, her smile returning a little more each day, but Razor could see the shadows of the past in her eyes whenever she looked up at him. It was clear she didn't fully understand the extent of the danger they had been in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something or someone who might come for them. Razor had kept his promise to Sarah and Emma. Frank was out of the picture, and they were safe, for now. But Razor knew better than to believe that peace would last forever. The world didn't work that way, especially when you were dealing with people like Frank. There were always consequences, always more people to answer to. Despite his best efforts to keep the threat away, Razor found himself constantly on edge. He spent more time on the road, checking in with Hawk and the others, making sure that nothing unexpected was coming their way. He had gotten word that Frank's associates were still looking for a way to strike back, but Razor wasn't worried. He had made it clear that anyone who came after Sarah and Emma would have to go through him first. He had fought too many battles to let anyone tear this new life apart. But even with all his preparation, Razor couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something he hadn't accounted for. The feeling grew stronger as the days went by. It wasn't until one evening, when he was sitting in the small living room with Sarah and Emma, that Razor finally realized what it was. They had just finished dinner, and Emma was curled up on the couch with a book, her legs tucked under her. Sarah sat across from her, quietly sipping her tea, a thoughtful expression on her face. Razor had been silent for most of the evening, his mind consumed with thoughts of what was to come. But as he watched Emma laugh softly at something in her book, it hit him. It wasn't just about protecting them from Frank and his associates anymore. Razor had promised to give them a better life, but he hadn't thought about what that meant for him. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, walls that had kept out anyone who might care, anyone who might want to get close. But now, sitting there, surrounded by Sarah and Emma, Razor realized that those walls were still there, and they were keeping him from fully embracing the life he had promised them. Razor stood up, the weight of the realization settling heavily on his chest. He walked to the window and stared out into the night, his mind racing. He had promised to protect them, to keep them safe, but in doing so, he had created a distance between them, one that could never be filled as long as he kept holding on to the past. He had built this life for them, but was he really living it? He wasn't sure. As the days passed, Razor's thoughts lingered on that question. What did he really want now? Was he capable of being more than just the man he had been, more than the protector and enforcer? The weight of it all pressed down on him. It wasn't just about fighting for them anymore. It was about fighting for himself, too. But every time Razor tried to let his guard down, he found himself pulled back into the mindset he had spent so many years cultivating. The mindset of a fighter, of a man who only knew how to protect others by using violence. That night, after putting Emma to bed and seeing Sarah off to sleep, Razor stood in the darkened hallway, looking at the door to the room that had been set up for him. His leather jacket hung by the door, a reminder of who he had been. The man who had lived his life on the edge, who had known nothing but the harsh realities of the road and the club. Razor's eyes shifted to the small room across the hall where Sarah and Emma slept. The faint light of the nightlight illuminated the shadows, casting a gentle glow on the door. It was a peaceful, quiet scene, and Razor felt a pang of something in his chest. He wanted to be part of that. He wanted to be the man who could sit down at the dinner table with them, without the weight of the past hanging over him. He wanted to be the man who could protect them not just from the dangers of the world, but from the darkness inside him. It was a fight Razor wasn't sure he could win, but he wasn't going to stop trying. The next morning, Razor woke up early, the sunlight streaming through the window, warming the room. He stood up, his feet hitting the floor with purpose. Today was the day he decided to stop running from the past. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was time to move forward. Razor took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen, where Sarah was already up, preparing breakfast. "Morning," he said softly, his voice low but steady. Sarah smiled, her tired eyes lighting up as she turned to face him. "Morning. Sleep well?" Razor nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. "Yeah," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "I've been thinking." Sarah put the spatula down and turned to him, her expression serious. "About what?" Razor hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put it into words. "About us. About everything." Sarah's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't speak. She just waited. Razor took a deep breath. "I've spent too long running, hiding behind the walls I've built. I can't do that anymore. I promised you and Emma a better life. And I intend to keep that promise, not just by protecting you, but by being here, really being here." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She simply walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Razor," she said softly, "you don't have to do this alone." Razor looked into her eyes, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to run anymore. For the first time in a long time, Razor felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. He wasn't just going to protect them anymore. He was going to build a life with them, no matter what it took. The days after Razor's decision to be fully present in his new life with Sarah and Emma were a slow, transformative process. He spent time with them in ways he had never thought possible, learning to navigate the delicate balance between being their protector and being the father figure and partner they needed. Razor found himself changing, little by little, as the days went on. He had spent years in a constant state of alert, always on edge, always ready for the next fight, the next confrontation. But now, as he watched Emma laugh as they made pancakes together, or Sarah smile at him from across the table, he felt something different, a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Razor still couldn't help but feel that something was out there, waiting. He had made a promise to protect them, and no matter how much he wanted to believe everything was over, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't quite finished yet. His instincts had saved him countless times before, and they hadn't failed him yet. One afternoon, while Sarah and Emma were out running errands, Razor sat on the front porch, his thoughts drifting. He had put all his energy into protecting them, but he knew there were forces at work behind the scenes. Frank's people, the ones still left in the shadows. Razor had made it clear to them that he wasn't going to be intimidated, but that didn't mean they had given up. The question was, how far would they go? Razor's musings were interrupted by the sound of a car approaching. It was a familiar sound, the low rumble of a motorcycle. He stood up, instinctively placing his hand on the gun at his hip, but he relaxed when he saw Hawk pull into the driveway. Hawk had been his right-hand man through this whole ordeal. Quiet, calculating, and loyal, Hawk had proven time and again that he could be counted on. Razor knew the moment he saw him that something was wrong. Hawk's usually calm demeanor was gone. His expression was tense, his eyes scanning the area as he got off his bike. "What's going on?" Razor asked, his voice low, a hint of concern creeping in. Hawk didn't answer right away. He walked up to the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel. "We've got a problem," Hawk finally said. Razor's heart rate quickened. "What kind of problem?" Hawk looked over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. "There's word on the street. Frank's people, they've got someone else after you. Not just after you, Razor, but after Sarah and Emma too." Razor's stomach tightened at the mention of their names. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Hawk's face hardened. "I don't know yet, but they're not wasting any time. They know about the house. They know about Emma, and they're closing in. I'd say we've got maybe 24 hours before they make a move." Razor's mind raced. He had promised Sarah and Emma that they were safe, but the danger was still out there, and this time, it wasn't just Frank's people. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, but he wasn't about to let them take his family away. He didn't answer immediately, his mind running through the possibilities. He could fight, but if they were targeting Sarah and Emma directly, he needed to be strategic. He couldn't risk losing them. "We need to move them," Razor said finally, his voice firm. Hawk nodded, understanding immediately. "I'll make the arrangements. But we need to be quick. They won't wait long." Razor's mind was already working through a plan. It wasn't enough to just move Sarah and Emma for a night or two. They needed to be safe, far away from any potential threat. He couldn't risk them being exposed again, not after everything they had been through. He walked into the house, where Emma and Sarah had just returned. The moment Emma saw him, she smiled, but Razor could see the tension in her eyes, the way she hesitated before speaking. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious. Razor didn't want to worry her, but he couldn't lie. "We need to go. It's not safe here anymore." Sarah's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She could see the seriousness in Razor's face. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's been some movement," Razor said. "Frank's people, they're still after us. We have to leave. Now." Sarah nodded, already understanding that there was no time to waste. She moved quickly, gathering a few things, while Razor turned to Emma, who was looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Come on, kiddo," Razor said, kneeling down in front of her. "We're going on a little trip." Emma nodded, her eyes still filled with a mixture of concern and trust, and for the first time, Razor saw how much she had come to rely on him. He stood up, his mind already working, making sure every detail was in place. As Sarah finished packing, Razor grabbed his phone and made a call. He needed to move quickly, but he also needed to make sure they were prepared. The last thing he wanted was to run into another trap. Razor didn't tell Sarah or Emma everything. He couldn't. They didn't need to know the full extent of the danger. But as he led them to the car, he promised himself that he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt them. Not now, not ever. Razor couldn't predict what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't running anymore. He was fighting for them. For Sarah. For Emma. And this time, he would make sure they would never be in danger again. As the car sped down the highway, Razor couldn't help but feel a weight pressing on his chest. The decision to leave wasn't one he had made lightly, but it was the only option left. The streets were unfamiliar, the roads twisting into places he had never been, but the feeling of running was something he had known for too long. Razor wasn't used to this, being forced into a corner, running from danger, running from the very people he had sworn to protect. But now, as Sarah sat quietly beside him in the passenger seat, Emma clutching her stuffed animal in the back, Razor felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: uncertainty. It wasn't just about the people after them. It wasn't just about Frank's associates and the men he had once considered enemies. It was about the life Razor had built for them, a life he had promised to protect, a life that now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Razor wasn't used to feeling this way. He had always been in control, always had a plan, always knew what he was doing. But now, as the miles stretched between them and the life they had known, he was starting to question everything. How could he keep them safe if the threat was still out there? What would he do if they came for them again? Razor's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He wasn't going to let them take Sarah and Emma. Not again. "Where are we going?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. Razor didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, trying to focus, trying to push the worry to the back of his mind. "Just driving for now," he said, his voice steady. But the lie was evident. Sarah turned her head to look at him, her eyes soft, but there was concern there too. "Razor," she said, her voice gentle. "We can't keep running forever." Razor's jaw tightened. He knew what she meant. They couldn't keep living like this, on the run, looking over their shoulders every second. "I know," he muttered, his voice low. "But right now, we don't have a choice." Sarah didn't push him any further. She knew this was hard for him, maybe harder than anyone could understand. Razor had spent so many years building a wall around himself, pushing people away, trusting no one. But now, with Sarah and Emma in the car, he felt exposed, vulnerable. He wasn't used to that. Razor glanced in the rearview mirror. Emma was staring out the window, her small face pressed against the glass as she watched the world go by. Her eyes were filled with wonder, but there was a sadness behind them that Razor couldn't ignore. She didn't understand why they were leaving, why they couldn't stay in the house they had just started to settle into. He had promised her a better life. But was this better? Was it worth it? Razor shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He wasn't going to let himself doubt. Not now. Not when they had come this far. They drove for hours, the sun setting and the night taking over the landscape. Razor kept his eyes on the road, focused on the destination, though he wasn't sure where that was. He had made some calls earlier, set up a place where they could stay for a while, but Razor knew it wasn't going to be enough. As the night stretched on, they pulled into a small town, a place far from the city, far from the life they had known. Razor didn't know if it was safe yet, but it was as close to safe as he could get them. He parked the car in front of a small motel, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. Razor turned off the engine, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to stay alert. They couldn't stay here long. But for tonight, it would have to do. Razor turned to Sarah. "We're here," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, though her expression was uncertain. "How long do we stay?" she asked. Razor didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure. "Just for a little while," he said, finally. "We'll figure it out." The three of them got out of the car, Razor leading the way to the small motel office. He could feel the weight of every step, the feeling of being on the run still heavy on his shoulders. The motel clerk didn't say much as he handed over the key to a small room at the back of the building. Razor paid for the room in cash, his eyes scanning the area as he turned to lead Sarah and Emma to their temporary home. The room was small but clean enough, a simple bed and a small table by the window. Razor closed the door behind them, locking it carefully. He didn't trust anyone here. Not yet. Not until he knew they were safe. Sarah and Emma set their things down, the room suddenly feeling cramped and unfamiliar. Emma flopped onto the bed, looking up at Razor with wide eyes. "When can we go home?" she asked softly. Razor's heart clenched. He didn't have an answer for her, not a good one. "I don't know yet, kiddo," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "But we're safe here for now." Sarah sat down beside Emma, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice gentle. Razor nodded, though he wasn't sure how they would figure it out. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. But one thing was clear. As long as he had Sarah and Emma by his side, he would keep fighting. He wasn't going to let anyone take them away from him. Not now, not ever. Razor stood in the doorway, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the decisions ahead of him, the uncertainty of the road they were on. But he had made a promise, and Razor always kept his promises. He wasn't about to let this be the end of their story. He would protect them, no matter what it took. The quiet of the motel room felt like a temporary peace, but Razor knew it wouldn't last. Sarah and Emma were settled in for the night, but the unease in his chest kept him from sleeping. He kept checking the windows, making sure no one was watching, his mind always scanning for threats. The silence in the room was only broken by Emma's occasional laughter as she flipped through a book, her small feet swinging from the bed. Razor didn't want to think about what might be coming, but it was hard not to. The feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows was stronger than ever. Frank's associates might have been waiting for an opportunity to strike, and Razor wasn't about to be caught off guard. He had done everything to protect Sarah and Emma, but he knew that sometimes the worst things didn't come with warnings. He had to be ready. As he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small, dim light that flickered in the corner of the room, his mind raced. What could he do to ensure their safety? How long could they keep running before someone found them? Razor stood up and paced the room, every muscle in his body tense. He wasn't the kind of man to sit idle, waiting for something to happen. He needed to make sure they were safe, but he also had to protect himself from the feeling of helplessness creeping in. He had made a promise to Sarah and Emma, a promise to keep them safe, but how long could that promise hold if danger was always lurking? Razor couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just Frank's people. There was something deeper, something that he hadn't fully uncovered yet. That night, after making sure everything was locked up tight, Razor finally went to bed. The sound of Emma's soft breathing and the occasional rustling of Sarah's sheets were the only things that kept him grounded. Razor didn't sleep, though. He lay awake, his thoughts constantly churning, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. In the middle of the night, he heard something, a noise outside the room. Razor's body went stiff, and his hand instinctively went to the gun hidden under his pillow. He wasn't sure if it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but he couldn't take any chances. He slipped out of bed silently, careful not to wake Sarah or Emma, and made his way to the window. His heart beat faster as he peered through the blinds. There was a car parked across the street, its headlights off, but Razor could see the figure of a man standing next to it. The man wasn't moving, just watching the motel. Razor's mind raced as he stepped back from the window. It was too dark to see clearly, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was watching them. Razor's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his jacket, pulled the gun from under the pillow, and moved quietly toward the door. His mind raced as he thought about what to do next. There was no way they could stay here any longer. They had to move. Razor didn't want to risk putting Sarah and Emma in danger, but they couldn't afford to be trapped either. He quickly packed what little they had, the weight of the decision settling over him. As he prepared to wake Sarah, the thought crossed his mind that they might not make it out of here. But he had to try. Razor turned to Sarah, his face hard. "Sarah, wake up. We need to go. Now." Sarah's eyes flickered open, her face filled with confusion and fear. "What's going on?" she whispered, sitting up in bed. Razor didn't waste time explaining. He grabbed her arm gently but firmly. "We're leaving. I don't know how much time we have." Sarah looked around the room, her mind quickly catching up. "The man outside?" she asked, her voice trembling. Razor nodded. "We don't have time to explain. Just trust me." He turned to Emma, who was still curled up on the bed, her wide eyes watching him. "Emma, get up. We need to go." Emma's sleepy gaze met Razor's, and for a brief moment, the confusion in her eyes faded. She stood up quickly, grabbing her stuffed animal and holding it tight. Sarah, despite her fear, didn't question him. She grabbed what she could, and they moved quickly toward the door. Razor led them out into the night, keeping his head low, his gun ready. They moved as quietly as possible, but Razor could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the danger closing in on them. They made it to the car, Razor checking the surroundings one last time before they climbed in. The engine roared to life, and Razor pushed the car into motion, heading toward the open road. His eyes constantly scanned the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of movement behind them. He didn't know where they were going yet, but it didn't matter. He couldn't risk waiting around. He had to get them as far away as possible. Sarah was silent beside him, her hand resting on Emma's as the girl fell asleep again, her stuffed animal still clutched tightly in her arms. Razor's jaw clenched as he focused on the road ahead. It wasn't over yet. He hadn't kept his promise to them just to have it all fall apart. He would do whatever it took to keep them safe, no matter what came next. He had already faced so many battles, but this one would be different. Razor wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for a future, a life for Sarah and Emma, a future he was determined to protect. No one would take that from him. He would make sure of it. The night stretched on as Razor drove, the headlights of his car cutting through the darkness, his mind still racing with the thought of what had just happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, even though he had taken every precaution. The road was long, stretching ahead with no clear end in sight, but Razor wasn't worried about where it would lead. All that mattered now was getting Sarah and Emma to safety. The landscape blurred outside the window, the only sound in the car being the hum of the engine and the occasional soft breath of Sarah, who had fallen asleep beside him, and Emma, who was dozing off in the back. The stillness was almost surreal, but Razor could feel the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on him. He had made a promise to Sarah and Emma, and he wasn't about to break it, no matter the cost. He had come too far to turn back now. Razor's thoughts drifted to the past, the years of living for the club, the fights, the violence. It had been a life of constant adrenaline, but it had also been a life without meaning. Now, with Sarah and Emma in the car, Razor finally felt like he had a reason to fight. He had someone to protect. He had something worth living for. Razor glanced at the rearview mirror once more, but there was nothing in the distance. The night was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, Razor allowed himself to relax, just a little. They needed rest, and he needed to plan their next move. They couldn't stay on the road forever, but Razor knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something new, a future that he had never imagined but was now fighting for. The road eventually led them to a small town on the outskirts, a place far enough from the city to feel like a different world. Razor parked the car in a quiet lot, away from the main road. The town looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, but it was the perfect place to lay low for a while. Razor got out of the car, stretching his legs as the cool air hit his face. It was a relief to be out of the car after hours of driving, but there was no time to waste. He needed to find a place for them to stay. Sarah and Emma were still asleep in the car, and Razor didn't want to wake them just yet. He walked toward the small diner across the street, hoping to find some information about the area. Inside, the diner was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered at the counter. Razor made his way to the counter, where a middle-aged man with a friendly smile greeted him. "What can I get ya?" the man asked, wiping his hands on his apron. Razor looked around, making sure no one was paying too much attention. "Just looking for a place to stay for a couple of nights," Razor said casually. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't question him further. Well, there's a motel about 2 miles up the road. It's cheap, but it'll do the job. Razor nodded, thanking the man before stepping back out into the night. As he walked back to the car, he felt the weight of the world settle back on his shoulders. They were safe for now, but Razor knew this wasn't over. It couldn't be. He wasn't just running anymore. He was making a stand. He was fighting for a future, a chance for Sarah and Emma to live without fear. Razor couldn't promise them that everything would be perfect, but he could promise them one thing. He would never stop fighting. When he got back to the car, he gently shook Sarah awake. Time to move, he said softly. Sarah blinked, confused for a moment, but when she saw the determined look in Razor's eyes, she understood. She sat up, helping Emma get out of the car. Where are we going? Sarah asked, her voice still groggy but filled with concern. There's a place a couple miles down the road, Razor said, not wanting to go into too much detail. We'll rest there tonight. Sarah didn't argue. She trusted him, even when there were no answers, and that meant more to Razor than she could know. As they drove toward the motel, Razor felt the weight of the past few weeks lifting just a little. He had made it through the worst of it, and now he had a chance to rebuild. For Sarah, for Emma. The future wasn't going to be easy, but Razor was ready to face it. They parked in front of the small motel, and Razor quickly checked in, his senses still on high alert. He wasn't about to let his guard down. They settled into the room, the quiet hum of the air conditioning the only sound breaking the stillness. Razor looked at Sarah and Emma, both of them tired but safe, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. He had kept his promise. They were safe. Razor sat down at the small table in the corner of the room, watching as Sarah tucked Emma into bed. It wasn't perfect, but it was their life now. Razor's heart was full, knowing that he had given them the best chance he could. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Razor had never been more sure of one thing. No matter what came next, he would be there for them. He wasn't going anywhere. He had a family now, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. In this gripping Hell Angels story, Razor's journey takes him through a life of challenges and redemption as he vows to protect 2 innocent lives from a world of violence. From his days in the Notorious Club to making a promise to a mother and her daughter, this Hell Angel story shows the true meaning of loyalty, sacrifice, and the fight for a better future. As Razor faces danger from Frank's associates and other unknown threats, he must rely on his past skills and instincts to keep them safe while navigating the uncertainty of a new life. This Hell Angel story is filled with suspense, heart-pounding moments, and a deep emotional connection as Razor transforms from a hardened biker into a protector, all while trying to keep his family safe from the shadows of his past. With twists and turns, this Hell Angel story delves into Razor's internal struggle between the violent life he's always known and the family he has sworn to protect, offering a fresh take on the biker lifestyle. The road ahead may be dangerous, but Razor's determination to protect Sarah and Emma will lead him through the darkness, ultimately reshaping his destiny in this thrilling Hell Angel story.